I'm going to dive in. I'm Janelle Mercado. I'm project coordinator for SIP, and I'm thrilled to be your moderator for this breakout session. Before I hand this session over to your wonderful presenters to introduce themselves and their presentation, I wanted to review a few logistics. So this session will be recorded and archived on the conference agenda page after the conference for 1 month. Closed captioning is available by clicking on the closed captioning button on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. The interpretation icon in the same area will provide access to Spanish translation. We will ensure the ASO interpreters are spotlighted along with the presentation and presenters. Please ensure your volume is muted to avoid any background distractions while presenters speak. We encourage you to engage with others in the chat, and when possible, keep your camera on so we can see your beautiful faces. And with that, Sheraden, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce your session and your wonderful team.
Excellent. I'm so excited to be here. So are our expert panelists. Thank you, Janelle, and to the SIP team for having us. I'm going to set the stage for just a few minutes, and then we're going to dive into our panel today. And we'll make sure that you hear the amazing bios and a little bit about our speakers today. But first, let's do kind of a high-level look at advancing equitable and inclusive communities for all, and kind of prepare ourselves for lessons learned and for lived experience. Along the way, we're going to give a few tips and tools for advancing inclusion and access, and kind of thinking about how we learn to think about and see ableism. And that will also help us prepare to hear reflections and lessons learned from our expert panelists. We'll have a few scenarios where we want to get your feedback, audience, and your expertise, and then we'll have some time for comments and Q&A. So first, a little bit about us. I'm with the California State Council on Developmental Disabilities and get to work with these amazing leaders that you're going to hear from today. The State Council is established by both state and federal law as an independent state department, and we advocate and promote and implement policies and practices that focus on achieving self-determination, productivity, inclusion, independence, interdependence, and all aspects of community living for Californians with developmental disabilities and their families. And then this is a little bit visual description here. We have a lot of logos of different state departments and organizations and universities on the screen here. And so the council is made up of 31 leaders, governor appointed, and 20 of these 31 leaders on the council are non-agency leaders, meaning community leaders, who reflect the socioeconomic and the geographic, disability, racial, ethnic, and language diversity of the state. These leaders are either leaders with developmental disabilities or they are family advocates of people with developmental disabilities. And then the remaining voting council member slots are specifically for directors or designees from these state agencies, including California Health and Human Services Agency, California Department of Developmental Services, California Department of Rehabilitation, California Department of Education, California Department of Healthcare Services, and the California Department of Aging. And then we also have our federal partners, including Disability Rights of California and what's called the UCEDS, the University Centers for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. And that includes the UC Davis Mind Institute, the University of California, Los Angeles, specifically the Tarjan Center there, and the University of Southern California and Southern California's Children's Hospital, and the California Sibling Leadership Network. So really dynamic group of leaders on our California State Council. And then just a couple of things. In this last year, I was looking at some numbers, and we were able to focus on advocacy and systems change work impacting 9.3 million Californians last year, with over 78,000 people reached directly via meetings with us, collaborations with us, events with us, trainings, and chats. And over 20,000 people participated specifically in our trainings, And about 13,000 people got direct one-on-one support with their individual issues or systemic barriers or troubleshooting needs here in California. And we couldn't do this without the partnership of over 1,300 partners across the state, including SIP. So really happy to do that. And we were able to do this in 16 languages across the state. So that gives you a little sense of what we do. And in the deck that you'll have access to after this, we have a list of all of the state council's regional office. So you can reach out to the state council office closest to you if you have any interest in getting additional training or technical assistance or collaboration on a project that you might have on mind. Okay, so before we dive in, just a few notes of what we consider inclusion itself, right? You're going to hear lots of different examples and highlights and definitions of what we're thinking about and looking for when we're talking about inclusion. And so consider this, that inclusive education is referring to the practice, right? It's not a one and done, but a continuing practice that's including every student in general education, both in class and extracurricular activities, right? It's encompassing everything. So not just the in-classroom time. And so if you think about the 1973 Rehabilitation Act or Education for All Handicapped Children Act back in 1975, or the more recent IDEA, we know that these are, movements that emphasize the need for inclusive education, and more importantly, are affirming the rights of students with disabilities to have that free and appropriate education in the least restrictive environment. And we know that the US Department of Education, in a couple of years ago, but 2023, released some data showing that more than 66% of children with disabilities were in general education classrooms with whatever supports were needed. That was the case for 80% or more of their school day. So an interesting stat of how we're doing so far. And we're going to see some examples just in the next couple slides, specific from some meta-analyses from two documents that probably some of you know very well. One is from the Nebraska Center for Research on Children, Youth, Families, and Schools, came out in 2023. And then another one is from the Alana Institute with partners from the Harvard Grad School of Education and ABT Associates about 9 years ago at this point. And that's helpful because they analyzed lots and lots of different research and studies across the US. And this slide speaks a little bit about educators specifically and the role that educators play. And self-efficacy is so critical. And we know that there's that significant relationship between educator self-efficacy and the attitudes towards inclusive education. And so the more trainings and supports and resources and empowerment that educators have, we know that translates into real actions, attitudes, and actions towards inclusion. So important to keep in mind of how we can support our educators. And then regarding students with disabilities, we know that those students with disabilities who are fully included in general education have better outcomes in math and reading, fewer absences from school, fewer referrals for more challenging behavior, and have additional post-secondary education and employment outcomes and options post-graduation. And we know that over decades of research, that inclusive education generally has positive or neutral effects on students without disabilities. And particularly, there's studies that are showing that for students without disabilities taught alongside their disabled peers, we see demonstrated growth in social cognition and improvements in self-esteem and ethical principles and caring friendships, which is all what we want to do in terms of helping support and raise that next generation of leaders here in California and beyond. Okay, so a couple of tips and tools we wanted to cover before we dive in to our panel section. So when we talk about ableism, really, that's oftentimes a loaded word that can be triggering for some people. But it's important to acknowledge that ableist society is simply one that treats non-disabled people as the standard of normal living. And we know that that results in places and services and education and work that are built primarily to serve only non-disabled people. I mean, that's just the black and white of it all. We also know that ableism can take the form of ideas and assumptions and stereotypes and attitudes and practices can also take the form of physical barriers in the environment, and most importantly, policy. And we also know that most people are completely unaware of the impact or the role of how ableism is institutionalized. So as all of us here, we're all leaders in our respective areas of the state or in our respective school districts. It's so important for us to think about these systems and to analyze why we're making the decisions that we make, how we plan things the way that we plan. And it's important that we take time to think about systems and decision making that can fine tune our ability to both recognize ableism where it might be hiding, institutionalized, and then what we can do, right, to make better choices and to develop better policy as we go. And of course, some of this includes thinking with a framework of universal design for learning. Some of this is asking how we make decisions and who's involved in the planning and decision making, who's at the table, so to speak. And it also means developing where you can, formal and informal, advisory committees and partnerships and leadership opportunities with explicit power, both to monitor and advise leadership bodies in terms of decision making and policy, especially in areas of disability access and equity. And some of this is about being intentional, right? Designating somebody who's kind of that accessibility person at events, both on and off campus, to make sure that schools, that both educators and community members can get the help they need to troubleshoot. Making sure that for events or community activities or school activities, that both the time and the other resources, including financial resources, are budgeted for accessibility and inclusion so that it's not an afterthought. And then using things like plain language and accessibility checks for greater access and equity to any printed or posted material or written material. And then thinking about, as a part of your registration or planning for any event or activity in or out of the classroom, thinking about those access needs. For events, these are some of the things that we're talking about specifically. These are the broad categories of what somebody might plan for to really focus on inclusion and accessibility. So everything from registration process to any physical space or online space, how to accept and process accessibility requests, any budgeting needs, the advertising or the follow-up materials, things like restrooms and meals, and then how we talk about or advertise or use social media to network these things. And then lastly, in your leadership work in the region and in your district, you're likely going to encounter some barriers to inclusion that are harder to break through, and that's natural. So don't be deterred in that. Systems change really starts with us and our initial span of influence, but then grows as we leverage both our expertise as well as the expertise and partnership of others in your network. So this might mean getting more involved in planning and budget meetings. It might be attending more school board meetings or county board of supervisor meetings. And then these are some tips on this slide about that include using that wonderful blend, that winning blend of statistics and stories, because stories make you memorable and statistics make you credible when you're focused on systems change, whether that's in your school, your district, your community, and your state. All right, well, let's dive in. I'm going to take down these slides, read some bios, and we're going to dive into some questions here. So give me one moment to take this down. So excited to introduce you to your experts today. Okay, so let's see. And do we have folks pinned? Let's go ahead and pin our panelists here. Yeah, so I'll go ahead and introduce here. We're going to start, I'll go alphabetically. Rebecca Corbett, who is an advocate with the East Bay Legislative Coalition. Rebecca has been a self-advocate for much of her life, but has learned about systems advocacy about 10 years ago when being a part of an advocacy group called the Consumer Action Committee through her day program. As an advocate, she's spoken to a variety of programs in schools about advocacy needs and issues of importance for people with disabilities. She's been a part of the East Bay Legislative Coalition, on her county's Developmental Disabilities Council. She's participated in town halls and legislative meetings and legislative breakfasts. And recently, she was a presenter at the California Parent Teacher Association Convention, speaking on the values and the elements of inclusion education. And then ask her sometime about her involvement in rallies and die-ins and protests focused on disability rights and how lives of so many of us would be different if our government were to cut services, supports, and healthcare. Next, I get to introduce Elizabeth Grigsby, rights advocate with Golden Gate Regional Center. Elizabeth is an advocate for all people with disabilities and without, and she believes that we all have something special to bring to the table in leadership. She's worked for GGRC since 1995 as the rights advocate and provides education about the Lanterman Developmental Disabilities Act and self-advocacy, and serves on way too many committees and coalitions benefiting the community. She advocates for groups that benefit the community, and particularly for marginalized people to have their voices and their experience heard and respected. She speaks from her lived experience and from others. And previously, she's been an advisor for the People First chapter of Alameda County and served for 6 years on the Bay Area Regional Advisory Committee of the State Council on Developmental Disabilities, where she closed out her leadership there as a chairperson. Additionally, Elizabeth advocates for sexual health and safety and, believes, this is a quote from her, really believes that one day we can all be equals and have equal opportunities in life. She says, "I'm a disabled activist, and I'm not going to stop until the world that I want becomes a reality. And hopefully that will happen in my lifetime." Next, I have the pleasure to introduce Alex Madrid, housing specialist for Golden Gate Regional Center and with the San Francisco Mayor's Office on Disability Council. And Alex was born in the Philippines with cerebral palsy, and in the 90s moved to San Francisco and later attended the University of California, Berkeley. And while he was a student at UC Berkeley, Alex became a strong advocate for disability rights. He's currently the housing specialist at GGRC, and before that, he was a housing and peer support coordinator at the Center for Independence of Individuals with Disabilities in San Mateo. In his positions, he assists people with disabilities to identify resources and strategies and equipment for achieving maximum independence. He joined the San Francisco Mayor's Disability Council in 2017 and continues to be a champion for the rights of folks with disabilities in his community. And he's also interested in accessible transportation, accessible info technology, and programmatic access, and is a board member of San Francisco's In-Home Supportive Services Public Authority, as well as the Samtrans Citizens Advisory Committee. And lastly, so thrilled to welcome and introduce you to Emily Witkin, who is the chairperson for the California State Council on Developmental Disabilities Bay Area Regional Advisory Committee. In addition, she also serves as a tutor for K through 12 students with disabilities, all subjects through 8th grade, and specializing especially in math and science. And Emily's involved in social justice communities online and with others from the United States and overseas. She's also a voting member of the Bay Area Rapid Transit Accessibility Task Force. And previously, Emily served as the elected class president for the Transitions Options Program, otherwise known as TOPS, through Mount Diablo Unified School District. And during her time there, she organized fundraisers and worked to expand student leadership by creating new leadership positions for students with disabilities and establishing regular student council meetings so that students with disabilities had more voice in shaping their own programs. She's pursued her Master's of Arts coursework in educational therapy, and her interests include adult services, legal rights, healthcare advocacy, as well as areas like housing and employment. And she's an advocate for those in cross-disability communities, and as someone with multiple disabilities, knows about the strengths in peer mentorship, educational justice, and social justice advocacy. All right, folks. Yeah, rich topics, right? So let's jump right in here. So the first question that we have here, what was your experience like in school and at school-sponsored events? And maybe talk a little bit just about what were some highlights in terms of inclusive experiences or maybe more isolating or segregated experiences? Who wants to kick us off?
I can,
Okay, I'm going to call on you. Emily, go
I
for it.
can. Um, so I was in mainstream classrooms from preschool through college with a 504 plan starting in second grade after I was diagnosed with dyslexia. I assume that 504 meetings happened at some point, but I was never aware of them. And I do think that since my accommodations stayed very consistent over the years, um, there wasn't, once I was old enough that I might have been part of them, there wasn't a lot to discuss at those meetings. Like it was just sort of confirming that I still needed extra time on tests because I still read very slowly. Um, I attended private schools and I benefited a lot from the smaller class sizes and fewer disruptions in that setting. I can't filter out irrelevant auditory input the way that neurotypical people seem to do. And in adult education classes that I've taken since then, students coming and going and side conversations with TAs or aides mean that I miss portions of the lesson because I can't filter those out. That's just what comes to the front then, or I don't get either the side conversation or the main lesson. I was considered twice exceptional as a kid, both learning disabled and gifted. I benefited from an accelerated curriculum and thrived at summer programs serving gifted children. Although I would not have functioned well in a typical public school classroom, I would have been underserved academically in a special day class. In addition to dyslexia, I met criteria but was never diagnosed with selective mutism and was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder in my mid 20s. Fortunately, my schools and teachers were as committed to serving the weird, quiet kid as they were to the autistic selectively mute one. And I generally got my needs met through informal accommodation supports and accommodations on an as needed basis. Looking back, I rarely attended any school events that weren't mandatory. At the time, I didn't see this as a result of a lack of accessibility. I simply thought that school events weren't my thing. It's only more recently that I've come to understand that they should have been done in a way that could have included me comfortably. Uh, and I will let someone else speak now.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. Interesting reflection there. Thanks, Emily. Rebecca, why don't you share with us your experiences?
Okay, sure. So I didn't know I had a disability until I was actually in my 20s. But since I did have 4 heart surgeries as a baby, I did have uh, some like exercise classes away from my regular friends. And I did have some speech classes because there were certain letters that I couldn't pronounce very well. Uh, but I just felt like a normal, typical student, didn't know I had a disability, even though my sisters all had special ed classes. I was treated like a normal person. I did work as a TA for people in wheelchairs, and I did kind of see how different they are treated out in public, that sometimes they're more isolated, like, oh, we need to stay away from them instead of getting to know them. I did also have a church member who happened to be in a wheelchair. I'm used to that. I had issues with that. Um, I've been around my sisters who dealt with Special Olympics, so I knew there were people with disabilities, but I didn't know I had one on my own. But knowing that there were people with disabilities growing up, including one of my own classmates in elementary school, she just was treated like a regular student. She, even though she did have braces on her legs, she just felt like a regular student. So, but knowing how many types of disabilities there are, you can actually get to know them more on a one-on-one basis, or get to know them uh, interactively just out in public. Unfortunately, dances and special events that were at my schools were not always accommodating with people with disabilities. Um, Even though they did attend our assemblies, but they never attended our dances unless they were invited by regular students. But other than that, they basically had their own classroom, they had their own things, but were never really included. And I didn't see until later on that, wow, what a different world they had compared to the rest of us.
So that perspective of seeing the segregation and isolation of students with disabilities probably helped fuel your advocacy work once you identified as someone with a disability, right? So that probably
Definitely.
has something to do with your work today. Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you.
What about you, Elizabeth?
When I was growing up, I went to a special school here in San Francisco. It was called Sunshine School for the orthopedically handicapped, which they had pretty much everything at that school. They taught us how to people how to dress themselves, how to feed ourselves, and things like that. But they never really taught us or told us that they would be closing down and we would be mainstream into regular schools with non-disabled people. So when I transferred to a school called Sunnyside, I was mainstreamed into regular classes, which the teachers were kind of like, oh, you don't have to worry about doing the work if it's too hard. You could just sit here. And I was like, that's boring. I don't want to just sit around. I'm a student. Teach me. I could learn just like everybody else. Don't look at my disability as a problem. The kids loved me. They thought I was cool because I had a cool wheelchair. And they wanted to get to know who I was. But the teachers were mostly my problem. They kept saying, you don't have to do this. It might be too hard for you. How do you know it's hard for me? Unless you give me a chance. So
You had to be your best advocate, right? Until you found an educator that believed in you as much as you believed in you.
yes, it was once I got to high school and took the test. I blew a lot of teachers' minds. They were like, oh my God, you are really really smart. And it's like, duh. I tried to tell you guys, but that's the biggest disability. It's not my physical disability, which that's another story. But it's a lot of people's preconception and their attitudes.
So true. So true. I want to hear from Alex now. Alex, share with us what your school experience was.
So, I was, like most people in the pilot, I'm in inclusion classes. For, I just wanna give you guys some specific example of me advocating myself, for, if, school trips. I have to make sure that all the buses that for my school trip are accessible, and most at the time most buses are not accessible, and I have to, you know, ask specifically for accessible buses like a lift, and I have to really make sure that people have that access for me, and I have to really advocate for myself. Thanks to my inclusion teacher to start me thinking of what I need and emphasizing that this is what you have to do going forward and after high school, because nobody going to hand you free stuff, and and if you don't say anything, they're just going to assume that you don't want to participate, or um, that you're not interested of going to school trips or school events. So I have to really think about what I need. For example, having a para coming to the event, or to help me get my food or write some notes, things like that. So it really make me think about what I need and advocating for myself, because nobody gonna do that for me.
Yeah. And thankfully you had that inclusion teacher that kind of gave you those tips, right? Of, hey,
Yes.
no one's going to make things accessible for you. You have to plan ahead of time and then ask for what you need and advocate for yourself, which I'm sure kind of set you up for college, right?
Yes.
Where if you're not advocating for yourself, it's not happening. You know,
Yes.
speaking of that, I'd love to hear a little bit, just a very short amount of highlights of what was either post-secondary or college experience like for each of you, or employment supports. How was that transition from high school to adulthood when it came to employment supports and post-secondary supports? Alex, do you want to kick us off with that, since you talked about
Yeah.
your work in
Yes.
advocacy in K through 12?
Yes. So, like I said, I'm an inclusion teacher. Luckily, my inclusion teacher really started me off in a good steps. Really emphasizing from the get-go, asking me what the, what do I want to do after college, and where I want to go to, and of course, there's Berkeley known, and that was a dream. And after that, of course, there was some um um like a lot of some people telling me, "Oh, you cannot do that. It's too hard." A lot of smart people go to that, and I'm like, you know what? I'm gonna prove you wrong. And in my senior year, my culture teacher set me up with Department of Rehab,
Your
which
inclusion teacher set you up with Department of Rehab?
yes,
Mm.
to help me set up what I need and support on buying books, buying my assistive technology like computers, scanners, reading materials to support to succeed. And throughout your years in college, Department of Rehab is there to support me to succeed and finish college. And after college, they help me find a job. And um, I'm lucky enough to have a job right now.
So props to your inclusion educator partnering with DOR so that you had all the tools and the practical needs met for college. And then
Yes,
they came in after college. Yeah, that's great to help you
yes.
with employment. Yeah. Emily, what about you? What was your post-secondary life like, and any either work supports or post-secondary supports that you got?
Yeah, so I went to a small liberal arts college with a highly demanding academic program and a notoriously quirky student population. Although I did struggle a lot with my mental health during that period, it was still a really good time for me. And I loved both the academic and social sides of my college experience. I lived in a science-themed dorm all the way through and had what for me was a very rare experience of actually fitting in. Although neurodiversity wasn't talked about on campus at the time, many of us identified as nerds and geeks, and I suspect that I was far from the only undiagnosed autistic person in my peer group. Um, Employment, though, has been a little dicier. I've had very little employment support, not for lack of asking, but because what's typically offered focuses on things that have very little relation to my skills or needs. They'll suggest things like bagging groceries when I can barely manage to stay in a grocery store long enough to buy what I need that for the week. But meanwhile, I have years of experience tutoring and I'm comfortable teaching math up through first year calculus, which is, a marketable skill if I could market it. But none of the job coaches that I've encountered have any idea what to do with that, or how to help me build the rebuild a referral network that was disrupted by the pandemic. Um, I haven't really, I was living on word of mouth referrals, and those kind of petered out as when there's a break in that then you don't get the next year's worth of kids, and kids graduate and don't the parents don't have like friends whose kids are still in school after a couple years. um so yeah.
Makes sense. Yeah, thank you. Rebecca, how about you? What was post-secondary education or employment supports? What did that look like for you?
That was an interesting situation because I actually went to two junior colleges. One was Diablo Valley College, and the other one was Los Medanos College in Pittsburgh. I realized I was actually struggling at DVC, trying to take multiple classes at the same time, including two different English classes, and I kept on failing the class twice. So that's when I realized I am definitely struggling. And so when I was finally diagnosed as borderline intellectual functioning, and I was able to go to LMC, I actually was able to get the help that I needed, some tutoring help, extra time for testing. So even though I did have a disability, I still felt like a regular student, but I was glad to have the extra help because I was able to take just 1 or 2 classes at a time and my mind wasn't going crazy and realized I needed to slow down. In finding out that I had a disability, I actually found a day program called Futures Explored, and there was a branch of it called Alive, actively living in a variety of expectations. But yeah, through that, I was able to go to school, do my advocacy work, and actually work out in the public with the city of Brentwood in 2 different departments, which was their solid waste division and their wastewater treatment plant, aka the water department, and the trash department. And I felt like a regular worker there. I was able to interact with the workers, and I was actually a mascot for their annual open house where they invited school kids to come to the site and actually learn about the different departments of the city. And I had so much fun as the mascot interacting with the little kids. I think I've been used to being around little kids my entire life. So being a
Makes
mascot
sense.
made it so much better.
And that probably kind of helped fueled you into the way that you look for people and help people in your other jobs as well. Yeah.
Yep. And now I'm
Elizabeth,
actually getting paid for uh, advocating and doing presentations. So
the dream. Yeah.
go ahead,
Elizabeth, how
Elizabeth.
about you? Yeah, what was your post-secondary life and what kind of job supports did you get when you were fresh out of school?
My first job was incredible. I worked at the preschool in San Francisco called Laurel Hill. It's on Euclid by UCSF Hospital. It was the best summer job anyone could ask for. I don't know, little kids are just curious. They're not afraid to ask you questions. And again, they thought my chair was cool with all these buttons, and they were just curious. And that's what I think people should start with.
Got to
Teach
start
kids,
young, right?
teach kids not to be afraid of what's different. Because if we were all the same, I don't know about you, but that would be pretty boring.
It would be pretty boring. Yeah,
Yeah.
you're good. Okay, in 10 seconds, this is going to be a flash round, folks. In 10 seconds, what would you say is the one of the best things that educators and admins and students and families can do to ensure that students with disabilities are self-determined and can grow up to be strong leaders? What would you recommend?
I start children. I would suggest 2 things. One is and then ask them a lot of questions and allowing them to fail. I understand that we tend to shelter people with disability because we don't want to hurt them, but I would suggest let them fail and
Fail.
and and help them figure out what works and what doesn't work.
Yeah. So the dignity of risk, right? That classic dignity of risk, to be able to try something and fail and then have the supports to say, okay, what can we do next time? Or what supports would have made this better?
Yes.
Yeah. I love that. Emily, what about you? What would you recommend?
I would say foster a sense of entitlement. Um, I know from my own experience and comparing myself to my adult peers now, one of the things that most benefited me, I think, is growing up with the belief that I, of course, would be included. That I never, so then when I'm not, I get mad about it and am more likely to speak up. Whereas I see people who weren't raised that way, who don't want to make waves and accept being excluded from things that they shouldn't be, or think that they might be asking too much. And if you learn to take accommodations for granted, you're a lot more comfortable asking for them when they don't happen. Like, just kind of, why isn't this happening? Of course it's supposed to.
Yeah, quite very wise. Rebecca, what do you think? What would you recommend?
I'd say have the students that don't have a disability maybe actually work with someone with a disability, encourage them to kind of follow them around, join the activities that they're doing, work together. That way they can understand each other better.
So kind of cross disability, cross ability partnerships, activities, right?
Yeah.
Peer support going both ways.
Yeah.
Yeah. How about you, Liz? What would you recommend?
I would tell teachers and educators and parents the biggest thing to do for the kids with disabilities is believe in them. Even if they have disabilities, like they're nonverbal, don't say they can't communicate. Say they just communicate differently. Everyone can learn. Everyone can participate. So all they need is to be lifted up and believe in them and supported to have their own dreams and life. And they can go a long way.
Yeah. And it starts, to your point, it starts with others lifting up and giving examples and celebrating different types of communication and different types of leadership, right? Thank you, panelists. And back to you, Janelle. Thanks for letting us take those extra couple of minutes to get this last bit of expertise and wisdom in the room.
I'm
Really
so glad
appreciate
we
it.
did. I'm so glad we did. Rebecca, Elizabeth, Emily, Sheraden. I know Alex had to take off. Huge thank you to all of you. Your voices matter so deeply to all of us, and just appreciate you bringing your perspectives forward so that we can all learn and be better, do better. And for those who attended this session, thank you for your commitment to students with disabilities and their families. It's our mission to accelerate our educational systems to innovate, elevate, and impact outcomes positively for all from birth to childhood and beyond. The presentation slides and resources can be accessed in the session description section on the VFAIR's agenda. If you have any additional questions, please head to any of the information booths or in the chat, and you may be able to find your answers there. Be sure to join us now for our Lunch and Learn with Colette DeVito and our afternoon sessions. Don't forget to share your socials and tag at SIP Impact with hashtag SIPCon 2025. Enjoy, everyone. Have a good one.